During my annual expedition to touch some grass, I found these miniatures scattered all over the park.
Oh no!
As I have a ton of these miniatures laying around, converting them to Space Marines is probably the best thing I can actually do. I picked out my favorite looking Stormcast and got out the box of Space Marine bits. I picked up every single arm I could see in front of me and started testing them out to see which one actually had a visual match. The Intercessor arms were looking slightly out of place, mainly because the bodies were quite different. Biggest difference I noticed was the fact that their legs are very pointy and small. And the small looking legs remind me of the fact that Phobos armor has a very similar look to it. So I started looking through my collection of bits to see if I can find any Phobos arms. And visually, they looked much more appropriate and were a much better match overall. However, finding two arms that would actually match it was a bit more complicated than I expected. Some arms would outright not fit, mainly because the Stormcast bodies are a lot rounder than the Primaris ones and simply aren't a good match for some of them. The arm reaching for the holster showed a lot more promise. However, I was trying to bend it into place with so much force that I accidentally ended up snapping it. But I finally landed on the actual pieces I wanted, which is going to be this one-hander bolter, and then I actually ended up reaching out and finding this Intercessor arm that's holding a communication device. I spent quite a bit of time thinking what chapter should I actually make this guy into, which landed me on the Black Templars. Quite honestly, for no other reason other than the fact that this guy was looking very angry. First, I needed to address a pretty massive problem and close up this gap because who knows what's in there. I got a great suggestion in the previous video to cut up some sprues and then jam them in there, easily closing up the gap and making sure that I have a nice flush connection. Somehow, I expected that it would take a lot more time to find the right pieces, but literally the first two were a perfect match. Afterwards, I simply used a lot of sprue glue to fill it in. When I put on the arm, it was looking pretty fantastic. However, I did notice that it was bulging slightly out of the back, and it was because a small piece was actually sticking out. So I used the back of the X-Acto knife, and as it has a lot of sprue glue, I essentially was melting it and making it a very smooth surface. Afterwards, the arm went on like a charm, and it looked like it actually belonged there. Now, for the power pack, I didn't have any extras, so I ended up 3D printing a bunch of bits. And this Eternal Pilgrim Power Pack actually looked the most interesting, and it's by Greytide Studio. I was worried that a non-Primaris pack would look a little bit out of place. However, instead, this actually ended up enhancing the visuals of the model. Next up, I wanted to add some additional details to the model by adding a few pieces that I think will look cool. Thematically, the grappling hook seemed like a cool idea, however, visually, it just wasn't really a fit. So instead, I added some of these tactical pouches that always look really cool. And I almost committed a massive act of heresy by not including some purity seals on a Black Templar. Luckily, I managed to avert this horrible crisis from ever coming into fruition. With the final purity seal attached, this crazy looking Black Templar was looking pretty awesome. For the painting of this model, I want to go for something very similar to this. However, I want to improve on that style even further and also use some true metallics, as my non-metallic metals just don't really turn out that good. The color scheme will be consisting of only these 8 paints. To start off, I used this black red to sketch out the effect of the SL from the flame. With this, I'll have a much easier time when painting the rest of the model, as I'll be able to easily visually keep track of where the effect is coming from. For my armor, I used some black paint on its own and then grabbed some Luftwaffe by Vallejo and created a wet blending effect. This is the only place where I used the wet blending effect, as I wanted a much smoother transition between the black of the primer and the black of the armor. For the next layer, going for this very patchy look that I've been using quite recently. I'm not quite sure what's the best thing to call it, but it's very similar to stippling in its effect, but at the same time, it's slightly different in the way you apply it. After the patchy stippling, I added a tiny amount of white to my paint and began applying the first highlights. I wanted to improve this painting style by adding a smoother layer to the topmost parts of the armor. With this, creating a much more interesting contrast between the patchiness of the armor and then the smoother layer of the highlight. When applying this layer, I was essentially resting my brush on the piece of armor and then moving it downwards. For the next layer, I proceeded to add a tiny amount of more white, working my way up to the final highlight. I also made sure to include a tiny amount more water so that this time when applying that final highlight, it applies a lot smoother, but it also has an ounce of transparency, creating a much smoother transition. Then I took some of the deep red and mixed it in with the black paint, with this covering all of the purity seals as well as the Black Templar marking. Similar to my other Black Templars, I decided to give this guy a free promotion and not paint his shoulder pad white. As I already had some of this red paint on my brush, I also started work on the OSL effect. From here, using the deep red on its own to do my final highlight on the purity seals and the chapter mark. For the scrolls, doing a highlight of a near white color but still having some of that base in there. For the skin tone, I mixed a little bit of Bugman Glow with a little bit of black paint and then began applying my first layer, building up to the Bugman Glow on its own. For the next highlight, I decided to try something a little bit different, and I used that slightly colder white from the purity seals to paint his face. with this creating the idea that the light in front of him is much colder, especially compared to the bright blazer on his back. Using some of the white from the scrolls, I used it to add some of these white dots to the armor, creating the effect of concentrated light. I also noticed that my face was looking incredibly patchy and it just wasn't really a good look, so I reverted back to the previous layer that looked a lot more natural. Next up, I mixed a little bit of black paint in my previous highlight and began applying his hairline. This effect surprised me as I just did not expect it to look so natural and give the illusion that this guy has just very short hair rather than no hair whatsoever. Now moving on to the fire OSL effect. I did my final layer of using some of the red paint before moving on to the cadmium red. I continued using the area that my airbrush provided as a guideline and then slowly tried bringing in my colors and concentrating them inwards. I wanted to first transition from a very dark red to a very bright desaturated orange, making sure to always use my color on all of the areas where the light is supposedly hitting, creating the illusion of the flame getting roughly reflected in the armor. A much quicker solution would have been to just apply some white paint and then coming in with a cadmium red on its own. Even though this version is slower, it did create a nuanced effect that I was trying to achieve. I finally mixed in a near white version of the cadmium red and placed in my second to last highlights, before using white on its own for the final places where the flame is getting most concentrated. And now for the most satisfying step of using the Imperial Fist contrast paint, glazing it over the flame as well as all of the areas of the backpack and the shoulders. And in this step, trying my best to not accidentally go into any areas of the armor that are pure black, as that'll generate a very green looking effect. Now, having such a massive flame behind your head, especially without a helmet, is crazy even for a salamander. So I'd like to imagine that he's not actually helmetless, we're just able to see through the helmet. And for the final step of the flame, I added a tiny amount of white dots to simulate the fact that those are the hottest points of the flame. I took some of this frog green, mixing it with the black paint, and started applying my first layer of the watch OSL effect. This time avoiding the mistake I made in the previous video of using the frog green through an airbrush, which created a very messy looking OSL effect that I just did not enjoy. I also made sure to give some additional details to the model by giving the buttons on the watch some red, giving additional highlights to the purity seal, and then finally painting his weapon red in the similar color that's often found on the Black Templars. However, to make it different from the rest of the miniature, I also used a pale orange for the highlight rather than a saturated red. Painting the weapon also made me realize this backpack has these really cool candles on the back, so I made sure to paint those as well. And now comes the time to make sure that I have a really cool metallic paint, this time using burnt tin and green stuff world bronze. I wanted to have a very vibrant orange looking gold color to create the illusion, the fact that some of the flame is bouncing off the wall and is reflecting in the gold, and testing it on the miniature that I stepped on at the beginning of the video. Fun fact, I was actually trying to step over the miniature and then add the sound effect afterwards, however inadvertently I genuinely stepped on it. On the bright side, the sound effect was incredibly authentic. But back to the gold, for which I used some of the bronze pigment on its own to create a very bright concentrated highlight. I also realized that there was a golden trim almost on every single limb, so I decided to add an additional one to his arm just to balance it out visually. I used some gunmetal gray in the fish scales, however I personally regretted this and I wish I kept it black as I think it worked much better visually. But with the model nearly done, I made sure to finish up all of my tiny little details as well as correct some of the tiny little mistakes, for example where my gold slightly went outside of the trim. And thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Consider giving it a like, but for now, let's see the final result. Hey, and if you think the model looks cool, check out this video, and alternatively, this one's also pretty good.